Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our monthly Recovery Cafe volunteer training. My name is Brian. I'm the program manager at Recovery Cafe, Jefferson County. The purposes of these trainings are to connect with each other. We started this on Zoom in the middle of the pandemic, and it was one of the things that we felt we could do to build community. So I'm grateful to see folks still are accessing this and find it useful. We are recording so that we can post it later. And there are all of our archived trainings on our website. I'll send the link out in an email afterward. So that's one of the purposes, to build community. The second, of course, is to develop our skills, explore topics that we feel will be beneficial to either our own recovery or other people's recovery. And then the third is to become familiar with local resources and professionals who are providing services to the community that we serve here. So I always like to start with just like, what is Recovery Cafe? What is the role of a volunteer? And then I'll introduce Denise, our presenter for today. So Recovery Cafe is a community of people who are in recovery from all of the above. What we're intending to foster here is a safe, drug and alcohol-free space where people can find peer support for their recovery. We believe everybody's in recovery from something, so that it does include addiction, mental illness, which I think are usually associated with the term recovery. And it also means homelessness. It means any life challenge that you might be having. We like the inclusiveness of that language because I think it helps to destigmatize recovery issues. If I see myself as just somebody who's also needing people to help me out on my life journey, and I'm not here to fix anybody else's, I think it helps bring the power dynamic to be a little more even, which is what we're hoping to do here. So one of the things that we do to provide support is we do meal service here at the cafe. On Thursdays from noon to 3, we serve lunch. On Fridays from 10 to noon, we serve breakfast. This session is being recorded on August 20th, 2021, which, as you all know now, means that we do have a mask mandate in effect. So for those of you who are visiting our space, you will have to wear your mask. And then when you're eating your meal, having your coffee seated, you can remove your mask. The other ways that we provide recovery support to people are through membership. So membership means that you show up with 24 hours drug and alcohol free, you attend one recovery circle per week, and you give back to the cafe community in some way. So members benefit from those relationships they build in their circles, in the cafe space, and then they can participate in classes, such as Denise is teaching right now, a writing workshop for our members to participate in. We hope to have some more as we go down the road. So that's the role of a member. The role of a volunteer is somebody who commits to coming to the space on a regular schedule, whether that's once a month, a couple times a month, whatever works for you. And there's a few different things that volunteers can do. One of the roles is called a cafe companion. That's somebody who comes to the space to build relationships, to listen, to share some of your own experience, strength, and hope, to be a resource to folks if they're not familiar with how do I access this, that, or the other thing. And the way that I've been describing it recently to folks is that we have just different levels, I guess, of accountability and responsibility to making this a safe space. So I'd say volunteers have a higher level of responsibility for maintaining this safe space here. I expect volunteers to manage their boundaries well with other members and volunteers, and to approach staff if something's going on that they're not sure how to handle. And then, of course, there is staff, and the buck stops at us. We're ultimately responsible for maintaining this safe space and making sure that our members and volunteers are getting what they need. So that'll be it for my spiel today. We'd love to have you come down here. And with that, I think I would like to turn it over to Denise to present today on adverse childhood experiences and resilience.
Thanks, Brian. I guess just a little bit about me. Many of you already know me from the cafe, but what I do is I am a public health educator for Jefferson County Public Health. And that means that I work in the school districts. I work in the Chimacum School District specifically to help kids consider staying away from alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. And so Lindsay Scalf is also, who is also here today, is part of this community prevention and wellness initiative in the county and the state. And we do mainly prevention education in the school districts. Lindsay works in the Port Townsend School District. I work in the Chimacum School District, and we have just received a grant to work in the Quilcene School District. So we're in all of the school districts now, because Quilcene, Brennan is a feeder school for Quilcene, so we can actually do work in the Brennan School District as well. And so we do work in the school district, and that means also the community. So we run, Lindsay mentioned Guiding Good Choices, and that's a parenting sort of workshop that we do for people in the community. And it talks about, you know, how to communicate with your child to promote belonging and community and characteristics that will promote engagement, in positive engagement in your community. So I guess that's enough about me. I mean, I came here from Nebraska. You don't need to know my whole history, but I was a college professor in Nebraska, and I taught English and educational psychology. And so that's kind of why I'm doing a writing workshop at the Recovery Cafe right now. And I'm also a volunteer there. And so without any further, yeah, John. Do you have a question, John?
Oh boy. The during the consent agenda, it talked. Thing. Let me kill the video.
Hey, John, it might be, there you go.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I have a bad internet connection here. I was looking at the commissioners meeting on Monday, and I saw the grants that you received for the Quilcene and the expansion and continuation. Are those ongoing grants, or do you have to reapply for those types of things on a regular basis?
Well, we've had no, we don't have to reapply for them. They're ongoing. And the one in the Quilcene School District, or sorry, the Chimacum School District was the first one we received, and we received that in 2013. So that's how long we've been doing this there. We received the Port Townsend one in 2017. So we began all that work in 2018. And now we've added the Quilcene School District. So that money comes from substance abuse block grant at the federal and state level, and then a few other funding sources, and those are all pretty stable. Yeah, so we don't imagine this going away. Yeah.
Oh, good, thank you.
Yeah. So I guess with getting started, what I'd like everybody to do for just a few minutes is get in touch with how they feel in their body. And what I want to start with is I want to ask you to think of something that you're grateful for. So just something that you're grateful for. And once you have that in your mind, what I want you to do is I want you to sense how that feels in your body. When you feel grateful, how does that feel in your body? Sense that. So where do you feel it? How does that feeling affect your thoughts? How does it affect your nervous system? Pay attention to how you feel in your body. Okay. I'm not exactly sure how long we waited, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the mind-body connection, right? So first I asked you to think of something, and then I asked you to feel it in your body, what the effects of the thought are in your body. Today we're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences, and I'm going to ask everyone to turn off their microphones for a while because I'm going to go through a slide deck that lasts, I don't know, about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then we are going to open up for thoughts and questions and further advancement of what we're discussing. And so I'm going to share my screen, and then once I share my screen, I won't be able to see anybody. And so I ask you to hold your questions, maybe jot them down on a slip of paper next to you, or to write them in the chat, and we'll get to them after the end of the presentation. Okay. And so if everybody would turn off their microphones, that'd be awesome. And I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right, thanks, Brian. The scientific debate over nature versus nurture has ended. We know now that the memory of childhood experience is stored in our bodies and not our minds. From the beginning, as cells divide and the embryo develops, experience has a profound impact on who we are and who we will become. In the past couple of decades, there has been an explosion of new understanding, beginning with the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs study, about how and why adversity and trauma are reliable predictors of risks for mental, physical, behavioral health, and productivity in the population. And this is actually great news because what's predictable is preventable. Recent discoveries in neuroscience, epigenetics, epidemiology, and resilience help us to understand how protection, prevention, and resilience promotion can profoundly improve health, safety, and productivity, and can improve life satisfaction scores, all of which reduces public and private costs now and for generations. In every major public health discovery, the first actions that save lives are to, 1, accurately share the facts, and 2, take informed action within our own spheres of influence. Today, I will provide a brief overview of the main topics in a longer presentation called Understanding Adverse Childhood Experiences. The presentation includes an in-depth information about the neurobiological effects of adversity on development, the impacts of childhood adversity and trauma on population health, and resilience, what we can all do to improve health and well-being across the lifespan. Oops, sorry about that. Understanding ACEs is about discovery. It's a story of scientists who challenge themselves to think differently about the facts they could see. This is a story of their impatience with the amount of heart disease, diabetes, depression, and suffering that exists in our country. And finally, this is a story about you and me and about what we might do with a scientific discovery powerful enough to profoundly change the future of the public's health. Before I introduce the ACE study, I want to explain a little bit about brain development. The human central nervous system connects us to ourselves, to other people, and to the world around us. The central nervous system consists of the brain. It seems like I'm on the wrong slide. Sorry. Having a little trouble with the slides here. Excuse me. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord, and that integrate all of our senses and information from receptors located throughout the human body. The central nervous system regulates internal body functions and manages elaborate chemical and electrical signaling. The nervous system considers sensory input in the context of each and every second almost instantaneously, and determines our understanding of and response to the world we live in. Cells in the nervous system are called neurons, and neurons are stunningly effective at processing and transmitting information. And their central purpose in doing so is to adapt in ways that will keep us alive. So when, for example, people grow up in sustained danger, the stress hormones and neurotransmitters that are released as a part of the fight, flight, freeze reaction have impacts on the brain functioning en masse. The neurons adapt to this dangerous environment and by sending danger signals, which prepare the brain for living in a dangerous world. Characteristics like being quick to anger, slow to soothe, hypervigilant, and hyperreactive actually help the species survive in dangerous times. But these same characteristics can also lead to cardiovascular disease, mental health challenges, and productivity problems. And they aren't particularly helpful characteristics when not living through or in an imminently dangerous situation and environment. Dr. Martin Teicher, who's a leading researcher at the McLean Hospital and Harvard University, reviewed all these slides and approved all of this brain science facts in this presentation. Teicher says that when our biology actually collides with the social expectations, that's when we run into trouble. If you put a person from a very safe and sheltered childhood into a chaotic and turbulent environment of, say, riot control, that person may struggle unless some very specific skills have been learned. Likewise, a person adapted to dangerous, stressful worlds may not sustain patience, may overreact, may exacerbate the volatility of the situation, may not communicate or cooperate or follow protocol, may not use words as a first choice unless some very, very specific skills have been learned. So when a child from a chaotic and turbulent environment comes to school and we ask that child to sit still, share, cooperate, there can be a painful disconnect that's bad for everyone. The child will have to be actively taught the skills required to succeed in the context, just as we would train a person from a benevolent path how to act in a chaotic and dangerous world. We've been talking about the effects of toxic stress on individuals. Now we're going to turn and switch gears and talk about the effects of toxic stress on whole populations. The field of epidemiology is where we'll turn. Epidemiologists are scientists who study the origin of disease, disability, and productivity and health at the level of the population. They help us focus our efforts on issues and processes that will make the most difference for the most people. We're going to talk about a large epidemiological study about the enduring effects of adverse childhood experiences. Dr. Rob Anda and Dr. Vincent Folletti are the co-principal investigators of the study, which we call the ACEs study. Most studies of health and social effects of childhood abuse focus on a single type of adversity, such as sexual abuse. But the ACEs study broadened the picture to include multiple types of childhood stressors. In addition, the ACE study measured a wide array of health and social problems. The ACE study is unique because it provides the potential to understand how multiple forms of ongoing stress in childhood can affect many important public health problems. Design of the ACE study began in the early 1990s as a partnership between the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, and the Kaiser Permanente Department of Preventative Medicine in San Diego, California. What they did was they took more than 17,000 adult members of Kaiser Permanente's insurance plan, and they asked them to complete a survey about adverse childhood experiences, health behaviors, disease risks, mental health and substance abuse, and other health and social problems. The ages of these 17,000 people ranged between 19 and 94 years old. The study participants were generally well educated. Most had attended college, and only 6% did not have high school diplomas. And that's as compared with 13% of the United States population on the whole. Participants were predominantly white, middle-class people who had access to some of the best health care in the world. And study participants are still being followed to assess the relationship of ACEs to cause of death, incident of disease, healthcare utilization, and use of prescription medications. This slide shows the 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences that were studied. So on the far left, you see household dysfunction. In the middle, you see neglect. And then on the right, you see abuse. And there's 10 total ACEs. So the first group are indicators of household dysfunction, which include growing up with a substance abusing household member, growing up in the midst of parental separation or divorce, growing up with mentally ill household members or caregivers, growing up witnessing intimate partner violence, specifically having a battered mother, growing up in a household actively involved in criminal behavior as evidenced by having a household member being imprisoned. 3 forms of childhood abuse were studied: emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. And 2 forms of neglect were included: emotional neglect and physical neglect. As you can see from the percentages on the slide, ACEs are common in this middle class, well-educated population. The ACE study found that ACEs are highly interrelated. Where there's one ACE, there's likely others. So it didn't make sense to study one category of adversity at a time. It made more sense to study the accumulation of adverse childhood experience categories. So the scientists made a simple score. Each category of ACE adds to the total ACE score from experiencing 0 categories to experiencing all 10 categories. So ACE scores in the study range from 0 to 10. So people who report higher ACE scores are more likely to have health and social problems. In fact, as the ACE score goes up, the percentage of people with health and social problems also goes up. And we call this a dose-response relationship. And we all know dose response because that's if we put more gas in our car, we can drive more miles. That's a dose response relationship. In this case, where there's higher dose of adverse childhood experiences, there's a higher percentage of people with health problems. So looking at this graph, the percent of people with health problems is on the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis is the ACE score, with the far right being greater than 5. And you can see that that dose response relationship increases with the number of ACEs. You're more likely to have health problems. This is an example of a dose response relationship related to liver disease. This chart provides an example of the relationship between ACE score and a health problem, which is liver disease. Along the bottom horizontal axis of the chart are ACE scores from 0 on the left to 4 or more on the right. The vertical axis is the percent of the population with liver disease. And as you can see, the percent of people with an ACE score of 0 who had liver disease was just over 5%. And you can see that the percent of people with liver disease goes up in a stepwise fashion from just over 5% to 11% as the ACE score goes from 0 to 4 or more. People with an ACE score of 4 or more are more than twice as likely to have liver disease than people with an ACE score of 0. And this actually makes sense because the risk factors for liver disease include shooting up with drugs and needles and syringes contaminated with hepatitis virus, or having intercourse with a person infected with the virus, or consuming large quantities of alcohol. And the ACE scores increase all of the risks for liver disease also. ACEs are common. ACEs are highly interrelated. Evidence captured by the ACE score tells us that ACEs have a strong cumulative impact on the risk of common health and social problems. The ACE score is also a good proxy measure for the dose of toxic stress experienced during childhood. People with higher ACE scores are more likely to have multiple health and social problems, some of which increase the odds their children will have high ACE scores. The discoveries about the effects of toxic stress on the developing brain provide biologic plausibility for the ACE study findings. Scientists have established strong cases for including that the relationship between ACE score and health problems is a cause and effect relationship. This slide represents the center of it. It represents an oil slick. And I'll talk just a little bit more about this in a second, but preventing ACEs and their intergenerational transmission is the greatest opportunity for improving the well-being of human populations. In fact, this ACE study team and the ACE interface people who made these slides believe this is the greatest opportunity of our lifetimes. The slide before you represents the percentage of various health and social problems epidemiologists estimate are caused by ACEs. So the calculation commonly used to estimate this in public health studies is called population attributable risk. And on this slide, the the percentage of attributable risk caused by ACEs is displayed as an oil spill. The percentage of problem coded by the oil spill represents the percentage of each problem that is potentially preventable by preventing adverse childhood experiences. The percentages are quite large. In fact, the high percentages on this chart are rarely seen in public health studies. And the cumulative effects of ACEs reflect a powerful opportunity for prevention, no matter if you are working to prevent heart disease or cancer or end homelessness or hopelessness or improve business profitability. As we align a portion of our work around a common goal of preventing the accumulation of ACEs and moderating their effects, we will reduce all of these percentages and many others all at once. And so, like, for instance, if you look at life dissatisfaction, that 67.2% number, that is the percentage of life dissatisfaction that is caused by having adverse childhood experiences. So if we eliminated adverse childhood experiences or reduced them greatly, we would actually reduce that number. And likewise, the conditions distributed conditions disturbed 14 plus days of work or activity, just, whatever activity you do in any given day, that one is 61.4% preventable by reducing the number of ACEs that a person has. Suicide, 67%. Anxiety, 55.7. So that's how you read this oil spill. Core protective systems. There's a predictable pattern to transformative change. It begins with discovery and communication, which leads people to clarify their values and their thinking. With new knowledge and new habits of thinking, people change the actions they take in everyday life. The collective actions of many people shape a new reality that can become ratified in organizational and policy change. But the truth is that people create a new reality long before new laws are passed. Change is up to us. It is shaped by our thoughts, our conversations, the way we relate to one another in relationship, in families, and in communities. As we work to prevent the accumulation of adverse childhood experiences, let's keep in mind that we don't have to get to an ACE score of 0. Bringing scores down any amount will have a huge effect. As we thread through all of our work with a new focus on supporting adults, particularly adults who, through no fault of their own, experienced many ACEs when they were children, will prevent ACEs for the next generation. We might not be able to prevent the first ACE from occurring in a family, but we certainly can notice when children have 5 ACEs and make sure that the number doesn't go up. We live at a time of great hope and promise. The largest public health discovery of our time, perhaps of all time, is about family, community, children. It's about us. It's about our actions to prevent ACEs, whether large or small, and can profoundly improve our future. I want to take a second to thank everyone here for your volunteer efforts at Recovery Cafe and for supporting such a fantastic protective factor in our community. one that builds resilience in our community. And I also want to say that yesterday at the cafe, Michael talked about feeling gratitude inside yourself. And that's why I started this with that feeling gratitude inside yourself, because I want to suggest that cultivating internal gratitude is a great first step to developing and nurturing resilience. And I also want to say this, that adverse childhood experiences aren't just like, you know, I got yelled at a couple of times when I was a little kid. It's sustained chaotic neglect, abuse, unstable situations that you're growing up with. And so it's not like my parents spanked me a couple times. It's like, you know, I was always terrified for my life as I was growing up, kind of thing. And so I just want to distinguish that adverse childhood experiences, you know, are sustained negative experiences that someone goes through. But the good news is that there are ways to mitigate this, that resilience is the huge part of this that actually builds on community belonging, natural characteristics to survive, and programs that you can belong to. So it feels like it sort of feels like I skipped one of the slides because as I was going through this, I felt like I was just sort of pounding everybody with ACEs and not resilience. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now, and I'm going to open this up for conversation and question. I want to just say another thing about being aware of your own trigger points, and I want to tell just a tiny story about this bug that came into a room I was in when we were doing a community of practice around how to build resilience in communities and about this very subject of adverse childhood experiences. So there were about 20 of us in this big room down in Clallam County. And we were someone was giving a presentation on adverse childhood experiences, and we were all participating and watching, and it was in person, and maybe we were doing a little activity. And this enormous bug flew into the room, and it looked like it had a stinger. And like 5 people instantly froze and started kind of screaming a little bit, and people jumped up and moved back from their tables, and the bug landed on a table, and then it flew up and it landed on a window, and then it flew over here. And then I said, well, what we need to do is catch it and take it outside, and tried to move in a way that was efficient and calming. And so I got a glass and I got a piece of hard paper, and I walked over to this window where it had landed, and I covered it with the glass, and then I slid my paper under there and very carefully carried it out of the building and around the back. And then I put it down on the parking lot and pulled the paper out, and the bug was paralyzed. It didn't do anything. It couldn't move at all. And I backed away from it because I was afraid I was going to get stung by it. I backed away from it and I stood there for probably 3 minutes, and the bug didn't move at all. I thought, wow, how did we kill it? We're trying to be really careful. And that illustrates the central nervous system, how terrified that bug was. That bug was in absolute freeze situation because of the terror it had experienced. And then I came back in the room. I told that little story, and we all sat there and thought about how triggered each one of us was and how we reacted to that trigger, where some of us like screamed actually and ran to the corner, and some of us were kind of like, what should we do, and then we all kind of got together and calmed down and moved toward releasing the bug. And I think that's a really great story about what goes on in the human brain-body connection thing, that because of our neurobiology, when we are triggered, we are not using our prefrontal cortex. We're using our deep cerebellum, our survival brain. And so we are trying to respond in a way that helps us survive. Was that bug really that dangerous? Was it a lion that ran into the room? No, not really. It might have stung somebody, but maybe not. It wasn't really dangerous at all. But so many of us went immediately to that freeze, that deep cerebellum, and we were screaming and we were pushing away. And it wasn't just women. It wasn't like just women. It was women and men in this room. And so I think that illustrates for us what happens when someone is triggered. And it's difficult. And so, like, for instance, another story is I grew up in a really chaotic family. There were 7 children and 2 adults. We lived in a very small house with 1 bathroom. So there's 9 people in 1 bathroom. My parents, both of them, they owned their own business. And so they worked all the time. And I'm not exaggerating that. We had a phone in our house that was our floral shop phone. And they answered that phone, they answered it at night while they were there, if they were there. I mean, if they weren't out promoting their business or taking a wedding order or something like that. And so us kids were kind of on our own, and our house was a chaotic mess. Like, you could turn on the lights in the kitchen at night and bugs would just scatter across the room. And so we were 100% neglected. And so we were well loved, but we were totally neglected. And we all knew we were loved and we were totally neglected. So I had an accident when I was a 3rd grader, and lost so much blood that I was sick and fainting and that kind of thing. And we had to wait for my mom to come and get me. And we got in the delivery van, which, still had some floral arrangements to be delivered in it. And we drove up the street, and there was a blind man walking in the street. And my mom insisted that we help the blind man before we head to the hospital with me, who's sick, has been fainting, and has lost a lot of blood. And so she makes one of us kids get out of the car and ask the blind man if he needs help, that kind of thing. We get him in our car, our truck, and we take him home. And then we go to the hospital. So I'm like traumatized, and I'm in danger, right? So I'm completely in survival brain. And so fast forward to me being a mother, my son falls on his bicycle in a ditch. He breaks his arm. I can see there's a tiny little bit of bone that's going to start sticking out. His arm is completely crooked. And I go immediately into survival brain. And I like grab him and I get him in the car and I put a pillow under his arm and I drive as fast as I can. As fast as I can, not as fast as I'm permitted, to the hospital through a little town, you know, like I'm going 80 miles an hour down Columbia Avenue through this little town to get to this hospital. And I pull up behind the hospital at the emergency room and we go in and they have just had a different emergency happen in that room. And so a woman comes in and she's opening all these drawers, panicked like, and she can't find what she's looking for. They haven't had time to restock the room. And we're in there. And that I'm like 100%, I'm like at 100, right? My anger thermometer is at 100. And I'm of no use to anyone at that point. And so, right, there's an example, I mean, of what happens to us. And what we need to do is we need to recognize our anger thermometer. We need to slow down. We need to be curious. We need to be kind. We need to move slowly and deliberately and talk in a calm voice in order to get someone to restabilize, to calm down, that kind of thing. And so that experience in that emergency room was not at all calming. It was actually very terrifying, and it caused me to become more and more alarmed until I was like that bug in the driveway. I was just completely useless. I couldn't talk. I was just frozen. So with that, I'm just going to open this up. And Brian, you might have some things to say because you're so smart and so well versed in all of this. And everybody here might have some thinking and some thoughts about this. I deliberately left us quite a bit of time to have a conversation.
Well, first I want to say thank you, Denise, for presenting all of that great material and for providing real life examples to relate the material to real life. There's a lot, of course, that resonates with me and is related to, I think, the work that we do. I think it's just helpful to have this orientation in mind when we're thinking about the most vulnerable populations. Who are the people that we serve here? In particular, it's for me, you know, thinking about adverse childhood experiences reminds us to keep what I would call a trauma-informed perspective. You know, when we're thinking about what's the journey that this person has had, what have the experiences been that they grew up with, how did that impact their development, and how did that impact what behaviors we're seeing that were accommodating their survival, right? That's what it comes down to. These are survival skills. When we see someone whose behavior might look otherwise kind of baffling to us, kind of confusing, when it seems like to the outside observer, that's not going to serve your needs right now. What you're doing is going to result in the opposite of what you're actually looking for. That's sometimes what it can look like, right? But it's just a helpful reminder for us to ask that question of like, wow, what happened that would make that survival skill so useful to you for so long that that's now our go-to behavior. It becomes so ingrained. It's like breathing, you know, that is of course the next thing that we need to do to get from this moment to the next. Denise has shared this in a lot of different ways, and these are just different ways of framing it that have been helpful to me as well, right? Which is to think about our brains as we've developed are very good at keeping us alive, They keep us going from one moment to the next. All it has to do is be good enough at keeping us alive. It's not going to be perfect, right? It's not always going to result in maybe the best long-term solution, because that's what our brains evolved to do, just one moment to the next. It's very adaptive because it does keep us alive. So those three things that I usually hear associated with survival skills: fight, flight, freeze. I've heard another one more recently called fawn, meaning when you accommodate someone else, if you're in an unhealthy relationship, for example, and in order to survive, you give that person whatever it is that they're asking for, whatever it is that they want, whatever, it's all about you, because that keeps me alive, especially if you're in such a dangerous relationship as some people are. So fight, flight, freeze, fawn. That was something I wanted to add to this. And then the other thing that I wanted to add was, and Denise did a good job of explaining this as well, but is this the triune brain, the three-part brain, right? So generally speaking, there are lots of different parts of our brain, but generally speaking, we can break it down into three major parts. The brainstem, which is responsible for our automatic body functions, heart rate, blood vessels, that kind of thing, breathing when we're sleeping. And then we have the mammal brain that's responsible for our emotional responses. That's the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And then the frontal cortex, which is our higher functioning. It's our language acquisition. It's our relationship building. It's how we make meaning of things, problem solving, learning, those kinds of things happen up there, right? So I've seen someone depict this using their hand. If you think of your thumb as the brain stem, and then kind of the meat of your hand as the mammal part of your brain, and then your fingers are the frontal cortex. When someone is experiencing stress, a trigger perhaps to past trauma, it causes our brain to kind of flutter a little bit. Our prefrontal cortex can become overloaded, basically. This is when we call it flipping our lid, because now our mammal part of our brain is doing the work for us. And it's doing that because it keeps us alive. So much of this work becomes body work, the calming and relaxing things, right? Now, when I first started in this work, I would think of this stuff as like, okay, woo-woo hippie kind of bull, right? It's like, what are you gonna tell me, meditate and yoga? Like, all right, I'll leave that to the hippies, I guess. But the reality is, whatever it is that works for you, whether it's yoga, meditation, whatever, it's what grounds us in our bodies, what centers us here and now in the present moment, what reminds us to slow down. That's what we're trying to do. You can think of like when you have too much coffee, and we have our body responds to that. Our heart beats a little bit faster. We might feel a little bit in our bellies, kind of similar to anxiety. These are the body signals of the stress response. It's a very similar feeling when the hormones cortisol, which is the stress hormone, is dumped into our body. Adrenaline, when those are dumped into our body, it's telling us to be on edge, to be prepared, to do something. It gets our muscles ready, and we're not thinking, because we're literally not able to use that part of our brain when we're in our survival mode, right? So this is why a regular practice for someone, especially who's experienced a lot of adverse childhood experiences, having a regular practice where we're grounding ourselves in our body, that regular practice helps us then when we are in that moment of stress to bring our body back down to baseline. When we're able to slow things down a little bit, then we can use the rational part of our brain to assess, is this life-threatening or not? Is this bringing up some of my past trauma? And that's why I'm feeling the way that I am. You guys probably have experienced this where like, all of a sudden you made a split-second decision. I don't even remember why I made that decision or what happened, It's like I blacked out or something. And then I look back and I'm like, Jesus, I did it again. Why do I keep doing that? This is part of it for a lot of us, at least, is, again, it's adaptive and it's normal. That's something else that I really like about this, is that it's human. This is something that all of us do. It is a matter of, as Denise was sharing earlier, that like dose response relationship. How frequently did this happen in your childhood so that your body was learning how to survive? For those who were exposed more frequently, your body learns and it becomes more and more ingrained. That is the thing that I need to do. But it is just a normal stress response that every human being has. It's just a matter of how ingrained did it become for you. So again, I just love the orientation. I really like the presentation, Denise. Thank you. It's helpful for me when working with individuals to remind myself that, you know, when we see someone who doesn't appear to us to be acting rationally, well, their brain is doing its job. It is keeping them alive. It's just can be helpful to us when we're wanting to maybe help someone de-escalate, right? Bring things back into the body, bring things back into the here and now, the present moment. One resource I wanted to offer is a book called The Body Keeps Score by a physician named Besser Van de Kolk. And I can share this in an email later. He goes into great detail about trauma and how it lives in your body at like a cellular level. It's again that learned survival response that like I said, it just lives in our body. That's what keeps us going. So it's just to reiterate, I suppose, that importance of slowing down, being here in our body. So I could go on, but I want to open up to other folks.
Yeah, and Brian, before anybody else talks, I want to just say something about how being aware of your own triggers is so important. You know, in your daily life, you know, so like the more aware of you are, the better able you are to keep yourself in your prefrontal cortex, right? And also, the more aware you are, the more often you keep yourself in your prefrontal cortex, the more quickly you change those neural pathways, because the brain is plastic. And so plasticity tells us that we can retrain our brains. And so it might be that when we were kids, going from, 8 to 14 years old, our neural pathways were pruned to survival instead of to benevolence, that we can change that now as adults, right? The more aware we become of how we are triggered, the more able we are to change our behaviors, right? And so I just wanted to add that in, that we actually, awareness is power in terms of helping ourselves. And then there was this amazing example of a person who has actually been able to do this. So a person I know we were in a group. This person has myriad adverse childhood experiences that they have been working on for a long time. And something happened in this situation where someone was making a joke about in junior high school, how you used to burst those ketchup things if you were kind of a wild kid. So at lunchtime, like you bang on the ketchup thing and it would explode and go everywhere. And that was ha 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 for junior high kids. So this person was illustrating that and banged down on a table much, much harder than they had expected. They were banging down on it. It totally triggered this other person. And immediately I saw tears come to this other person's eyes. I saw this person fling themselves back. And then I watched as the person tried to recompensate, tried to put themselves back together. And so then the person got to the place where speaking was possible and said, that loud noise, violent noise triggered me. And then that was all the person could say. And then the person, the person who banged on the table apologized. We kind of started talking about the joke of that. And then the person who was triggered got up and walked outside and stayed outside for a while, and then came back in and sat back down. So what this illustrated was how well that person recognized their own trigger and their own response to trigger and knew how to take care of themselves. And so got up and went outside and then came back in and was pretty okay. Not 100%, but pretty okay. Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of cool once you become aware of your triggers and you become aware of your responses. And it really, really does help change your brain. The floor is open. Anybody who wants to talk.
Denise, I want to thank you. This is something I'm super, super interested in, and actually something I'm working on with my therapist. I would love to have a class at the Recovery Cafe for adults. It's so, when you start realizing that whole thing about the prefrontal cortex and how you've lost access to it when you're in the I understand it as the amygdala holds the seat of emotions. And so if that's even a possibility somewhere down the road, that would be awesome. I thank you. I also had a question about the study of the 17,000 or however many people were. Was it evenly distributed between men and women?
You know, I could probably find the breakdown of male, female, but it was not specified for women or men. It was a general population of people between the ages of 19 and 94, and it was men and women.
Okay.
And in terms of the adverse childhood experiences, I bet you there are numbers, that are specific to women and specific to men. I bet they arrange the data that way in some study, but I'm not privy to it. Yeah.
I was just curious.
Yeah. No, that's a fabulous question. Yeah.
So there was that diagram that showed the effects of ACE on the population, and one of it was 54.3% use of pot. What can you tell me in what way pot is has a negative effect on people who tend to use that?
Well, we haven't studied the effects of marijuana really in depth because we weren't allowed to, because of the way the drug was classified until it was declassified, and then studies began to happen when it was made legalized for medical use and then legalized for general recreational use. And so now there are more and more studies that are being made around marijuana use. And that's what you meant, right? By pot?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, all right, okay. I just wanted to make sure, because I don't have the slide open in front of me anymore. So I just wanted to make sure that it was marijuana use. What we know is that the THC in marijuana attaches to the cannabinoid receptors in your brain and increases them, and then that has effects on your response, your timing, your response timing. It has effects on some people's level of feeling of well-being. And so some people become very paranoid when they're using excessive amounts of marijuana. And so I'm not talking about, and I don't think they're talking about, the person who smokes some dope once in a while. I think recreationally, and I don't think they're talking about a person who's using a population group who's using marijuana medically under the supervision of a physician. And so they're not really using marijuana that is designed to promote the intense high. They're using marijuana that's designed to address a specific problem, right? Because if you go into the marijuana store out by Chimacum, there's a whole design on the wall that tells all the chemistry of the THC, what it does to what part of your brain, all that kind of thing. I think that what this is talking about is misuse of a recreational product, and so they're thinking if we reduced the number of people who misuse this product, then we reduce the percentage of ill effects caused by that product. I think that's what that was. I hope that's helpful.
I just wanted to add a couple of things, if that's okay. And because I think we can acknowledge that most substances, I mean, they have different effects on us and different levels of risk associated with their use. I think that's totally fair to say. Something like fentanyl and heroin, which you can overdose and die from a harm reduction standpoint, is more alarming to me than something like marijuana use. Alcohol use, in fact, I would put up as causing greater harm to the individual and the community. Now, that said, there are people who can use substances recreationally with little to no consequences on their physical health, on their relationships, on the community around them. So with marijuana, I'm glad Denise brought up, like, there's this funny legal area that it's in right now. And when it's descheduled, then we can study more the long-term effects that it has on folks. I think that'll be really helpful to us to determine what role should this substance have in our society. And part of this is for us to decide, you know, this is kind of an ethical question, right? Many substances have helpful uses, medicinal uses. This is true for morphine is medical grade heroin. We use that for surgeries, right? And I do also, I'm confident, I don't know for sure because I'm not a researcher or a scientist, but I'm confident that cannabis, CBD, THC have uses as well to help people with medical issues. What I'm really hoping that we get to see more of is what are the appropriate applications of it, what are appropriate doses, under what conditions, for which medical issues, things like that. So I'm really looking forward to seeing more of that. I think one thing I will say generally about substance use is that, again, kind of how Denise was talking about it, like, what is our relationship with this substance? What purpose is it serving in our lives? Is it helping us to meet the need? And what impact is it having on the rest of my life, on my relationships, on how connected do I feel? Any consequences for my physical health? So, and I see Lindsay is contributing lots of resources, and because the next point that I was going to make, my understanding of how the how marijuana works, especially on the adolescent brain, is that it our brain, as we learn over time, does this thing called pruning. We make tons of connections in our brain early on in infancy and toddlerhood, tons and tons and tons of connections. And then as we learn and grow and are exposed to other things, certain connections become much stronger and other connections are pruned away because they're not as needed. Now my understanding is if you use marijuana during this period of your development, it does something called over pruning. So some of these connections that are really important to have in our brains, we may lose some of them. Again, I think an area for more research, but I appreciate the question.
So, how do the way I tell if somebody's overusing is because their health is affected, they no longer have relationships, and they're not connected to community. So were those the three things that I'm looking at to see if it's become overuse?
It's a good question. So we have to be a little bit careful to not diagnose people because we're not medical professionals, and that's not our role here at the Recovery Cafe. What I really like to do is everybody is the expert on their own lives and on their own experience. And I believe people are intelligent enough and aware enough that they get to determine what is the right thing for them or not. So this is a very different approach than you'll see probably in treatment and maybe even the medical world. I don't really know that, but the conversation that I like to have with somebody is, what's your relationship like with substances these days? And they'll tell you maybe how frequently they're using it. Like, nice, okay, well, how are you feeling about your substance use? And having those kind of open-ended questions, and then when they start to tell you, well, I really get this out of it, because let's be real, people are getting some benefit out of using, right? So, well, I get this benefit that makes me feel a little less stressed, or I don't feel as much pain because I've got chronic pain, and it's better than the opioid they prescribe me or whatever. I hear that all the time, right? Okay, so let's acknowledge that benefit, and then let's weigh that out. Are there any other things that you don't like about it? And then encouraging them to have those conversations with their medical providers, because I'm not here to give that advice. I'm here to help someone explore that relationship and then refer them to appropriate resources, people who are better trained and better equipped to provide those services.
So, a question about roles. So as a mother, it might be better if somebody else had the conversation than me and one of my children.
I want to let Denise take this one because she works with young people with substance use. Is that okay, Denise?
Thank you.
Yeah, that is always the challenge, right? How do I talk to my young adult about using substances, right? And then they say everybody's doing it and that kind of thing. So if a person is going to address that with his or her own child, I think that coming at it from a point of curiosity is much, much more effective than coming at it from a point of, you will not use this. This is really bad for you, that kind of thing. Coming at it from a point of view of curiosity. How do you feel when you're high? Or what do you know? What do you know about the marijuana that you're smoking? What do you know about the different levels of, what do you know about THC? That kind of thing, with a genuine curiosity about it, that you want to have a discussion with that person. And while you're doing that, what you're actually doing is you're validating that person's level of knowledge. You're validating that person as a knowledgeable human being with some thoughts and opinions and facts of his or her own. And then you could say, you're having this conversation. I actually read something about how when your brain prunes connections, that sometimes there's this thing called over pruning among young adults who use who use marijuana, or young adults who use alcohol, and likewise young adults who have experienced a lot of trauma in their lives, you know? I mean, so you're not like putting the pin right in marijuana. You're saying there's lots of these things. Marijuana is one of them. And so the approach is not to trigger the person you're talking to into a place where the person just can't do anything but be defensive. Because once someone just becomes defensive, you know you've triggered them. And it's not like you don't know what triggered them. It doesn't have anything to do with I hate you. It has to do with the person has been triggered. And so maybe their feelings of belonging have been triggered. Maybe their feelings of authority have been triggered. Maybe their feelings of self-esteem have been triggered, that kind of thing. And so when you are approaching a person that you want to talk about sensitive subject, especially with a young adult, about their use of marijuana, scare tactics don't particularly work. Authority doesn't particularly work. Another thing you can do is you can say, you know, that healthy, if your child is saying everybody does this, everybody smokes pot, what the hell, you know, why are you on the wrong page here? The thing is that you can say, actually, you know, that healthy youth survey they make you take in school, that actually tells us that only like 32% of the kids use pot. So that would be the majority of kids actually don't use pot in your age range. You know, you can, and those are self-response. And then if a child says, well, yeah, but everybody lies on that, then you can say, well, actually they have questions in that survey that are designed to identify people who are just lying. So like there will be a fake drug and they'll say, have you ever used marijuana, alcohol, methamphetamine? And then they'll name something like Zoroaster, you know, and the kid writes, yep, I've used that one. It's like, well, that doesn't exist. And so we know the kid didn't use that one, right? And so they eliminate surveys that are shown to be falsified, right? And so the results of those healthy youth surveys don't include those surveys where the kid lied the whole time, because they have ways of identifying that through the questions. And it's not about identifying the kid, it's just through the questions. So you can use that. So you're using self-reported by kids facts. Actually, not everybody's using, the majority say they don't. And those statewide and regional-wide healthy youth survey results are accessible through Ask. I think it's AskHealthyYouth.com. Yeah, and so anybody can have those results. And then also respecting the person with curiosity, learning together, all those kinds of things are much more effective than hard-nosed type of authority undermining the person's own sense of power and efficacy, that kind of thing. Yeah, Brian?
Well, one thing I wanted to add, and this may or may not apply to being a parent working with a child, but an approach that we've used here is, I mean, ideally we'll have gotten to know somebody pretty well. We'll be able to reflect to them and observe for ourselves if there are patterns or cycles, changes in behavior, mood, demeanor, that kind of thing. But coming out of a place of concern, because I care about you and here's what I'm seeing. And you've told me this is what you want out of your life. And then I'm seeing this happen. Are you okay? Can you help me understand what's going on? Can we support you in some way? This approach I like to use here, like being in a peer program means that we do get to bring some of ourselves to this work. And the more like professionalization in the medical world that you get, then the more and more rigid boundaries that you get. And these are necessary roles, of course. We have to have doctors and we've got to have treatment and things like that. But this is just a unique aspect of this program, is that I get to say, hey, you know, when I'm seeing this happen, here's how I'm feeling, you know, because I've gotten to know you, I really care about you. And it makes me sad. It makes me sad to see you go through this right now. It's not because I want to shame that person. I'm just trying to be real. I'm trying to connect with them, you know? And it may be that they've never had somebody in their lives who cared about them enough to say something like that, to just say like, you know, that's my emotional reaction to it because I'm a human being and it's hard to watch people struggle, you know? It's something that I like to use here with some of our members. We do have like 5 or 6 minutes left, Denise, so I'll leave it to you to help us wrap up.
Yeah, any last question or thought or word of wisdom?
I wanted to just say, with what Brian just said, it reminded me of a time with my adult son. He came to visit, and I had noticed that his drinking had become more of an issue with me. And so I just said something to him. It was about the day before he was going to leave. And I said, you know, I'm just really kind of concerned. I'm noticing that you're drinking a lot more. And I'm just thinking that you might want to look at that. And he said, really? And he says, I said, yeah, I think it's possible that you could have a problem with it. And he said, oh, but I have friends who are alcoholics and I'm not like them. And so sometimes people, but he came around and he did start looking at himself, and then he actually cut way back. But without, I mean, just hearing Brian say that, I at first thought, should I really say something to him, talk to him about it, because he's an adult? But I'm so glad I did, because it gave him something to look at about him. You know, he was able to look at himself. So just being concerned about somebody and loving them is just a big part of it.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Being concerned and loving towards someone is key to this. And Katie, you saw those numbers in the chat about the 54% female, 46% male. That's the adverse childhood experiences breakdown, male, female. And there's a link to the CDC right there also. And then there's that link to PubMed, and that's about cannabis. So, you know, I think that being aware of your own behaviors and being aware of how your behavior affects others, and being aware of your own triggers, and being aware of your own anger thermometer. I think all of those things are super, super helpful. And they're all ways that we can build resilience in ourselves. So I guess that's all I have to say. Thank you so much, everybody, for all this great conversation. And, you know, I hope that this was beneficial.
Thank you so much, Denise, for presenting today. Very much appreciated. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'll send a follow-up once I'm able to post this recording, and I'm going to look at changing the time so it doesn't conflict with our breakfast service here. We do plan on continuing these. Zoom in person, I'm getting feedback from some folks. I will let you know the details in email. So thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.